The autumn wind cut through downtown Cincinnati like a blade, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of chili from Skyline. Harold "Hank" Morrison pulled his worn army jacket tighter around his shoulders as he sat on the cold concrete steps of the Veterans Affairs building, watching another group of well-dressed office workers hurry past without so much as a glance in his direction. At 68, Hank's weathered face told the story of 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 decades working construction, and 5 years of battling bureaucracy for the benefits he'd earned with his blood and sweat. His once proud shoulders now curved inward, not from age but from the weight of being invisible in a country he'd served with distinction. "Next!" called the clerk from inside the VA office, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. Hank looked at the crumpled number in his palm, 247. The digital display above the reception desk showed 198. He'd been waiting since 6 in the morning, and it was now past noon. The man beside him, another veteran named Charlie Winters, shook his head in disgust. "Been coming here for 8 months trying to get my disability claim processed," Charlie muttered, his left leg bouncing nervously, a tic from his service in Desert Storm. "They keep asking for the same paperwork over and over. It's like they're hoping we'll just give up and disappear." Hank nodded, understanding all too well. His own claim had been in limbo for 18 months. The shrapnel in his left leg from a Viet Cong grenade still ached every morning, a daily reminder of the night his unit was ambushed near Da Nang. The VA doctors acknowledged the injury, had the x-rays showing the metal fragment still lodged near his femur, but somehow the paperwork always got lost in the system or required additional verification. "You know what gets me?" Charlie continued, his voice growing louder. "My nephew works at one of those tech companies downtown, makes more in a month than I see in a year. He's never fired a shot in anger, never slept in mud for weeks, never watched his buddies get shipped home in boxes. But he drives a BMW, lives in Hyde Park, probably never even thinks about guys like us." The afternoon dragged on. Hank watched through the large windows as the city buzzed with life around them. Food trucks lined the streets, serving gourmet meals to young professionals who discussed stock options and weekend plans in Aspen. The contrast was stark. Here sat men who had sacrificed their youth, their health, their peace of mind for their country, now reduced to begging for basic medical care and the benefits they'd been promised. When Hank's number was finally called at 3:47 p.m., he limped to window 6, where a tired-looking clerk named Janet barely looked up from her computer screen. "Morrison Harold, DOB 03-15-1955, she said mechanically, typing with 2 fingers while chewing gum. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm following up on my disability claim," Hank said, sliding a folder of documents across the counter. "It's been 18 months, and I was told last time that it would be resolved within 60 days. Janet clicked through several screens, her expression growing increasingly frustrated. "I'm not seeing your file in the system. When did you last submit your DD-24 tool?" 6 times, Hank replied, his patience wearing thin. "I've submitted it 6 times. The last time was 3 weeks ago, right here at this window." "Well, I don't have it in the system. You'll need to submit it again, along with your medical records and a statement from your commanding officer." "My commanding officer died in 2018, Hank said quietly. "I've explained this before. I have his death certificate and all the documentation from—" "Sir, I can only work with what's in the system. If you don't have the proper documentation, there's nothing I can do." Janet's tone had turned cold and dismissive. "Next!" Hank stood there for a moment, feeling the familiar burn of frustration and humiliation rise in his chest. Behind him, other veterans shuffled impatiently, their own stories of bureaucratic nightmares weighing heavy in the air. He collected his paperwork and turned away, his limp more pronounced as exhaustion set in. Outside, the evening rush was beginning. Hank made his way to the bus stop, checking his wallet for the fare. $3.47. Enough for the ride back to his studio apartment in Northside, where he'd heat up another can of soup and try to make sense of forms that seemed designed to confuse rather than help. The bus was crowded with commuters heading home to suburban houses with two-car garages and family dinners. Hank found a seat in the back, next to a window that overlooked the Ohio River. As the bus crossed the bridge, he could see Riverfront Stadium in the distance, where the Reds played. He remembered better times when he could afford season tickets, when he had friends to share games with, when the future seemed full of possibilities instead of endless red tape and closed doors. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter Sarah in Phoenix. "Dad, how did the VA appointment go? Call me later." She meant well, but what could he tell her? That her father, who once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, couldn't navigate a simple benefits claim? That the country he'd served with honor now treated him like a burden to be shuffled aside? The apartment complex where Hank lived was a testament to urban decay: peeling paint, broken security doors, and a parking lot full of potholes that collected rainwater like small lakes. His unit was on the third floor, accessible only by stairs that his damaged leg negotiated with considerable pain. The elevator had been broken for 2 years. Inside his sparse apartment, Hank made his usual dinner of tomato soup and saltine crackers, eating while standing at the kitchen counter and staring out at the alley below. A group of college students from UC walked by, laughing and carefree, their biggest worry probably an upcoming exam or what party to attend on Friday night. He thought about calling Sarah, but what was there to say? She was struggling with her own family. 2 kids, a husband who'd been laid off from the auto plant, mounting credit card debt. She didn't need to hear about her father's problems, didn't need to know that he sometimes lay awake at night, wondering if it would have been better to come home from Vietnam in a coffin, honored and remembered, rather than alive and forgotten. The local news came on at 11, and Hank watched as the anchor, a young woman with perfect teeth and an expensive suit, reported on the city's budget surplus, new downtown development projects, and the success of local tech companies. There was a brief segment about a veterans' food drive, a feel-good piece that showed volunteers handing out canned goods and blankets. The reporter interviewed a city councilman who spoke about supporting our heroes and never forgetting their sacrifice. Empty words, Hank thought. If they really cared, the VA wouldn't be understaffed and overworked. If they really cared, veterans wouldn't be committing suicide at a rate of 22 per day. If they really cared, men like him wouldn't spend their golden years fighting for benefits they'd earned 50 years ago. He turned off the television and prepared for bed, taking 2 ibuprofen for his leg and 1 for the headache that had been building all day. Tomorrow he would try again. Another day of waiting, another stack of forms to fill out, another chance to be treated like a number in a system that seemed designed to break his spirit. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city through his thin walls, Hank Morrison, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star winner, man who had given his youth and health to his country, felt more alone than he ever had, even in the jungles of Southeast Asia. At least there, he had known who his enemies were. The next morning brought rain to Cincinnati, a steady drizzle that turned the city's streets into rivers of grey water and discarded hopes. Hank woke at 5:30 a.m., not by choice, but because the pain in his leg always intensified with weather changes, and the coming storm had been announcing itself through his old wounds all night. He shuffled to the bathroom, his reflection in the cracked mirror showing a man who looked older than his years. The face staring back had deep lines carved by more than time. They were trenches dug by disappointment, frustration, and the slow realization that his country had moved on without him. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling his small kitchen with the only luxury he allowed himself: good coffee. It was a small rebellion against the poverty that VA inefficiency had forced upon him, a reminder that he had once been a man of modest means and simple pleasures. not a supplicant begging for what was rightfully his. His phone rang as he was getting dressed. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but these days, most of his calls were from debt collectors or telemarketers. He answered anyway, hoping against hope it might be someone from the VA with good news. "Is this Harold Morrison?" The voice was crisp, professional. "Speaking." "Mr. Morrison, this is Rebecca Chen from Cincinnati Children's Hospital Billing Department. We show an outstanding balance of $847 from your emergency room visit last month. We need to discuss a payment plan." Hank closed his eyes. The visit had been unavoidable. His leg had swollen to twice its normal size, and he'd been running a fever of 102. The emergency room doctor had prescribed antibiotics and recommended follow-up care with a specialist, care he couldn't afford without his VA benefits being approved. "I explained to your office before," Hank said patiently. "I'm a veteran waiting for my disability claim to be processed. Once it's approved, all my medical expenses will be covered by the VA." "Sir, that may be, but the hospital requires payment within 60 days. If we don't receive payment or establish a payment plan by the end of this month, we'll have no choice but to send your account to collections." After he hung up, Hank sat heavily on his threadbare couch, staring at the stack of medical bills on his coffee table. The amount was growing: $847 to Children's Hospital, $234 to the radiologist who read his x-rays, $156 to the laboratory that ran his blood work, $89 to the pharmaceutical company for antibiotics. Nearly $1,400 in total for treatment that should have been covered if the VA had processed his claim in a reasonable time. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had fought for a country that promised to take care of its veterans, yet here he was, facing financial ruin because he couldn't get the medical care he'd earned through service and sacrifice. By 7 a.m. he was back on the bus, heading downtown for another day of bureaucratic warfare. The other passengers were mostly service workers heading to early shifts: hotel housekeepers, hospital orderlies, restaurant prep cooks, people who understood struggle, who knew what it meant to work hard for little reward. They nodded at him with the recognition of shared hardship, a silent solidarity among those the system had left behind. The VA building looked even more imposing in the grey morning light, its brutalist architecture designed to discourage rather than welcome. Hank joined the line of veterans already forming outside, men and women of all ages who wore their invisibility like a uniform. There was Miguel Santos, who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and now lived in his car. Dorothy Williams, an army nurse from the Gulf War who cleaned office buildings at night because her PTSD claim had been denied. And Tommy Chen, a young Marine who'd lost his left arm to an IED in Iraq and was fighting for prosthetic coverage. They all knew each other's stories by now, bound together by their shared experience of being let down by the system they'd served. They swapped tips about which clerks were helpful and which ones seemed to take pleasure in creating obstacles. They shared information about food banks and free clinics, survival knowledge that no military training had prepared them for. "You hear about Pete Rose?" Miguel asked, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "He's supposed to be doing some kind of event at the ballpark next week, signing autographs for charity or something." "Charlie Hustle," Tommy said with a sad smile. "My dad used to tell me stories about watching him play. Said he was the kind of player who gave everything he had, every single game." "Unlike some people," Dorothy muttered, glancing toward the VA building's entrance, where employees were beginning to arrive for work, most of them walking quickly with their eyes averted from the line of veterans waiting outside. When the doors opened at 8 a.m., the familiar ritual began. Take a number, find a seat, wait. The plastic chairs were uncomfortable by design, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that seemed calculated to increase anxiety. The walls were covered with posters about veteran services that were either underfunded or so buried in red tape that they might as well not exist. Hank's number was called around 10:30, and he approached the window with his folder of documents, now dog-eared from countless submissions. The clerk was new, a young man named Brian who looked fresh out of college and seemed genuinely interested in helping. "Let me look up your file, Mr. Morrison," Brian said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. His brow furrowed as he scrolled through screens of information. "I see the issue here. Your claim was transferred to a different department 3 months ago, but there's no record of it being received. It looks like it got lost in the transition." Lost? Hank felt his blood pressure rising. How does a file just get lost? "It happens more than it should," Brian admitted quietly, glancing around to make sure his supervisor wasn't listening. "The computer systems don't talk to each other very well. When files get transferred between departments, sometimes they just disappear into the digital void." "So what happens now?" "Well, I can resubmit your claim, but you'll need to provide all the documentation again. And unfortunately, since the system shows no record of your previous submissions, you'll be starting over from the beginning. That means another 12 to 18-month processing time." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. After 18 months of waiting, he was back to square one. All the forms, all the documentation, all the medical appointments and interviews, worthless. He would be 70 years old before his claim was resolved, assuming it didn't get lost again. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Morrison," Brian continued, his voice genuinely sympathetic. "If it helps, I can put a flag on your file to expedite the process. It might cut a few months off the timeline." A few months, out of 18. It was like offering a band-aid for a severed artery. Hank walked out of the VA building in a daze, the rain now falling harder, soaking through his jacket and chilling him to the bone. He stood on the sidewalk, watching the city flow around him. Cars splashing through puddles, pedestrians hurrying under umbrellas, everyone with somewhere important to be, something meaningful to do. He thought about Sarah's last text, asking how the appointment went. What could he tell her? That her father, who had once been awarded a Bronze Star for carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, couldn't navigate a simple benefits claim? That the country he'd served was content to let him struggle in poverty and poor health while bureaucrats shuffled papers and collected paychecks? The walk to the bus stop seemed longer than usual, his limp more pronounced. The rain had soaked through his shoes and his socks squelched with each step. Other passengers waited under the bus shelter, but Hank stood in the rain, too defeated to care about getting wetter. When the bus arrived, he climbed aboard slowly, fishing for exact change, while the driver waited impatiently. The other passengers looked through him, their attention focused on phones and tablets, consumed with their own lives and problems. To them, he was just another old man, another inconvenience in their busy day. Back in his apartment, Hank sat in his one comfortable chair, a recliner he'd bought 15 years ago when he still had steady work and hopes for the future, and stared at the pile of bills on his coffee table. The medical bills, the rent notice, the electricity bill with its red final notice stamp. His Social Security barely covered rent and utilities, leaving nothing for food, medicine, or the basic necessities of life. He thought about calling Sarah, but what could he say? That he was failing at the simplest task of getting the benefits he'd earned. That he was drowning in medical debt because he couldn't navigate a system that seemed designed to break him. She had enough problems without worrying about her father's inability to function in the modern world. The phone rang around 6 p.m. It was Charlie Winters from the VA waiting room. "Hank, you hear about what happened to Miguel?" "No, what?" "He's in the hospital. Had some kind of breakdown at the VA office this afternoon. Started screaming at one of the clerks, threw his paperwork all over the floor. Security called the cops, and they took him to UC Medical Center on a psychiatric hold." Hank wasn't surprised. Miguel had been getting more agitated over the past few months, his frustration building with each denied claim and lost document. 3 tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, and a medical discharge due to PTSD, and the VA still questioned whether his condition was service-related. "They're saying he might get banned from the VA building," Charlie continued. "Can you believe that? A guy serves his country, gets messed up doing it, and then gets banned from the place that's supposed to help him." After the call, Hank sat in his darkening apartment, not bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, the city continued its evening routine. People heading home from work, families gathering for dinner, children playing in yards and parks. Normal life continuing while he existed on the margins, invisible and forgotten. He thought about Miguel, alone in a hospital bed, his mind fractured by experiences that most Americans couldn't imagine. He thought about Dorothy, cleaning office buildings at night because her PTSD claim was denied. He thought about Tommy, struggling to find work with one arm because employers didn't want to deal with the complications of hiring a disabled veteran. And he thought about himself, a man who had once been somebody, a soldier, a construction worker, a father, a taxpayer, a contributing member of society. Now he was just another number in a broken system, another file to be lost, another veteran to be forgotten. The rain continued to fall, drumming against his windows like the distant sound of gunfire, bringing back memories he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. But unlike the enemies he'd faced in Vietnam, this battle had no clear objective, no way to win. It was a war of attrition designed to wear him down until he simply gave up and disappeared. As he finally drifted off to sleep in his chair, Harold Morrison wondered if that might not be the point after all. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of crisp October day that made Cincinnati's neighborhoods look almost cheerful despite their struggles. Hank woke in his recliner, his neck stiff and his leg throbbing from sleeping in an awkward position. The pile of bills on his coffee table had been joined by yesterday's mail, another notice from the hospital billing department, and a letter from his landlord about next month's rent. He was making his morning coffee when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and he considered not answering. He wasn't ready for another conversation where he had to pretend things were getting better, where he had to reassure his daughter that her father was handling his problems like the strong man she remembered from her childhood. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, injecting as much cheer as he could muster into his voice. "Dad, you sound tired. Are you eating enough? Getting sleep?" "I'm fine, honey. Just had a long day at the VA yesterday." "How did it go? Any progress on your claim?" Hank stared out his kitchen window at the alley below, where a stray cat was picking through garbage with the determined focus of someone who knew what it meant to be hungry. "They're still processing it," he said, unable to bring himself to tell her the truth about starting over. "These things take time." "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe you should come out here to Phoenix. Jake's doing better at work now, and we have the guest room. You could see the grandkids more, and the VA hospital here might be more helpful." The offer was tempting, but Hank knew he couldn't become another burden for his daughter's family. They were barely making ends meet as it was, and adding a sick, broke old man to their household would only strain their resources further. "That's sweet of you to offer, but I'm settled here. Cincinnati's my home. Besides, I can't run away from this VA claim. It would just follow me to Arizona anyway." After they hung up, Hank decided he needed to get out of the apartment before the walls closed in on him completely. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the bus stop, planning to ride downtown and maybe walk along the riverfront. Sometimes the movement helped with the pain in his leg, and the fresh air might clear his head. The bus was less crowded on Saturday, filled mostly with people heading to weekend jobs or running errands. Hank found a seat and watched the city pass by through the scratched windows. Cincinnati was a city of neighborhoods, each with its own character and challenges. Over the Rhine was gentrifying rapidly, pushing out long-time residents who couldn't afford the rising rents. North Side, where he lived, was still struggling with abandoned buildings and limited services. Downtown was all gleaming towers and expensive restaurants, a world apart from the reality most residents faced. He got off at Government Square and walked toward the riverfront, his limp more noticeable as the morning wore on. The Ohio River moved slowly past the city, carrying barges loaded with coal and grain toward destinations downstream. Across the water, the hills of Kentucky rose green and peaceful, a reminder that there was still beauty in the world if you knew where to look for it. The riverfront had been redeveloped in recent years with new restaurants, shops, and entertainment venues designed to attract tourists and young professionals. Hank found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, watching joggers and families with young children enjoy the perfect autumn day. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing and taking selfies with the Cincinnati skyline in the background. Their biggest concern seemed to be which filter to use on their photos. Hank remembered being that young once, before Vietnam, before the nightmares, before he learned that the world could be cruel and indifferent to suffering. Beautiful day, isn't it? Hank turned to see an elderly black man settling onto the other end of the bench. He was well dressed in a casual way, clean khakis, a polo shirt, and a light jacket that looked expensive but not flashy. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. "Yes, it is," Hank agreed. "Makes you forget winter's coming." "You from Cincinnati?" the man asked. "Born and raised." "You?" "Moved here in the early 70s to play baseball. Stayed after I retired. The city grows on you." The man extended his hand. Pete Rose. For a moment, Hank didn't process what he'd heard. Pete Rose was a name from sports history, not someone you met on a park bench on a Saturday morning. But as he looked more closely at the man's face, recognition dawned. "The Pete Rose? Charlie Hustle?" Pete smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "That's what they used to call me. Though I'm just Pete these days." "And you are?" "Harold Morrison. Hank, Wow. I watched you play when I got back from Vietnam. You were something else." "Vietnam, huh? When were you over there?" "2 tours, 69 to 71. Got back just in time to watch you guys win the World Series in 75 and 76. "Those were good years," Pete said, his expression growing more serious. "I met a lot of Vietnam vets back then. Tough time for you guys, coming home to, well, it wasn't the welcome you deserved." Hank felt something loosen in his chest. Here was someone who remembered, someone who understood that the homecoming had been almost as traumatic as the war itself. "What brings you down to the riverfront on a Saturday?" Pete asked. Hank found himself talking more openly than he had in months. Maybe it was Pete's genuine interest, or maybe it was just the relief of talking to someone who didn't see him as a problem to be solved or a number to be processed. He told Pete about the VA, about his claim being lost in the system, about the medical bills and the mounting debt. Pete listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. When Hank finished, they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the river flow past. "You know," Pete said finally, "I had my own troubles with bureaucracy over the years. Different kind, but I learned something about fighting systems that don't want to help you." "What's that?" "Sometimes you need someone on the inside, someone who knows how the game is really played." Pete pulled out his phone. "I've got a friend who works with veterans issues. Not at the VA. She's with a non-profit that helps navigate the system. Her name's Jennifer Martinez, and she's helped a lot of guys like you. I appreciate the offer, but I can't afford to pay someone to help me get benefits I already earned." "Who said anything about paying? This is what she does. Helps veterans cut through the red tape, pro bono. Give her a call." Pete handed Hank a business card with Jennifer's information written on the back in neat handwriting. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Pete was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water. "When I was playing, I learned that baseball was a team sport. You couldn't win alone, no matter how good you were. After I retired, I realized life was the same way. We're all on the same team, Hank. Some of us have been lucky enough to have good innings, and when we do, we help the guys who are having tough at-bats. They talked for another hour about baseball, about Cincinnati, about the changes they'd seen in the city over the decades. Pete had stories about playing with Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan, about the Big Red Machine and the excitement of those championship seasons. But he also asked about Hank's service, about his family, about his life before the bureaucratic nightmare began. "You know what I remember most about those championship years?" Pete said, as they prepared to part ways. "It wasn't the individual stats or the records. It was the feeling that we were all pulling in the same direction, that we had each other's backs no matter what." He stood up and extended his hand again. "Call Jennifer. Tell her Pete Rose sent you, and Hank, don't give up. You've fought tougher battles than this." As Pete walked away, Hank sat holding the business card, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone drowning, but the steady, grounded hope of someone who had found an ally in an unexpected place. He looked out at the Ohio River, still flowing toward its destination despite all the obstacles in its path. Maybe there was something to learn from that persistence, that steady forward movement, even when the way wasn't clear. That evening, back in his apartment, Hank stared at Jennifer Martinez's business card for a long time before finally dialing her number. It went to voicemail, but her message was professional and warm, inviting callers to leave detailed information about their situations. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Harold Morrison, and Pete Rose suggested I call you. I'm a Vietnam veteran having trouble with my VA disability claim, and I could use some help navigating the system. Pete said you might be able to point me in the right direction." He left his phone number and hung up, then sat back in his recliner and allowed himself to imagine, for the first time in months, that things might actually get better. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing someone else's story, someone else's struggle or triumph. For the first time in a long time, Harold Morrison went to sleep, believing that tomorrow might bring something better than disappointment. Monday morning brought Jennifer Martinez's call at 8:17 a.m., just as Hank was finishing his coffee and preparing for another day of battling the VA bureaucracy. "Mr. Morrison, this is Jennifer Martinez. I got your message about Pete recommending my services. I'd like to meet with you today if possible." Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to cutting through red tape, but there was warmth there too, a genuine concern that gave Hank his first real hope in months. "I should warn you," Hank said. "I can't afford to pay much. My finances are—" "Mr. Morrison, let me stop you right there. I don't charge veterans for advocacy services. That's not why I do this work. Can you meet me at the downtown library at 10? Third floor, reference section?" The Cincinnati Public Library's main branch was a massive Romanesque building that had served the community since 1955, its stone walls housing not just books, but also social services, computer access, and meeting rooms for people who had nowhere else to go. Hank arrived early and found Jennifer already waiting at a table, surrounded by legal pads, file folders, and a laptop computer that looked like it meant business. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 45, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intense brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her handshake was firm, professional, but her smile was genuine as she gestured for him to sit down. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." For the next hour, Hank told his story again, but this time felt different. Jennifer asked specific questions, took detailed notes, and occasionally made small sounds of recognition or frustration that told him she'd heard similar tales before. When he finished, she was already making notes on a separate pad. "Okay, here's what we're dealing with," she said, consulting her notes. Your claim was initially misclassified, then transferred to the wrong department, then lost entirely during a system migration. Classic VA incompetence, but unfortunately not uncommon. The good news is that you have excellent documentation of your service and medical conditions. The bad news is that we're essentially starting over. That's what they told me at the VA, 12 to 18 more months of waiting. Not if I have anything to say about it. Jennifer's expression had hardened into something that reminded Hank of a general planning a military campaign. I've been doing this for 8 years, Mr. Morrison. I know which buttons to push and which people to call. More importantly, I know which laws require the VA to act within specific timeframes. She pulled out a business card and wrote a phone number on the back. This is the direct line for Congressman Brad Wenstrup's Veterans Affairs Liaison. Brad's a veteran himself and takes these cases seriously. I'm going to call him this afternoon and get a congressional inquiry started on your claim. Is that legal? Jennifer laughed, the first time Hank had heard genuine laughter in weeks. Completely legal and highly effective. The VA can ignore you, Mr. Morrison, but they can't ignore a sitting congressman asking pointed questions about why a decorated veteran's claim has been lost for 18 months. Over the next 2 hours, Jennifer built what she called a battle plan. She copied all of Hank's documentation, creating multiple sets of files. She helped him draft a formal complaint to the VA's Inspector General. She prepared a timeline of his claims journey through the system, highlighting each failure and delay. Most importantly, she gave him something he'd lost months ago, a sense of agency in his own fight. This isn't just about your claim, she explained as they worked. The VA's problems are systemic, and every case we win makes it a little bit easier for the next veteran who needs help. You're fighting not just for yourself, but for guys like Miguel and Dorothy and Tommy. Speaking of Miguel, do you know what happened to him after his breakdown at the VA? Jennifer's expression grew sad. He's in a residential treatment program now. The incident at the VA was actually a blessing in disguise. It got him the immediate mental health care he needed. Sometimes the system only responds to crisis, which is tragic but true. By noon, Jennifer had filed formal complaints with 3 different oversight agencies, initiated a congressional inquiry, and scheduled Hank for appointments with 2 different VA advocates who specialized in appeals. She'd also connected him with a pro bono lawyer who handled veterans' disability cases and a social worker who could help with his mounting medical bills. "Why do you do this?" Hank asked as they prepared to leave the library. "You could make a lot more money in private practice." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, gathering her papers. "My father was a Navy corpsman in Korea. Came home with frostbite injuries that never healed properly. Spent 15 years fighting the VA for disability benefits. Died of a heart attack the month before his claim was finally approved." She looked directly at Hank. "I do this so other daughters don't have to watch their fathers die, waiting for help they earned with their blood." That afternoon, Hank's phone began ringing. First, it was Congressman Wenstrup's office, scheduling an appointment for Wednesday morning. Then it was Dr. Sarah Kim from the VA's Quality Assurance Office, asking detailed questions about his claim and promising a full investigation. Finally, it was Brian, the young clerk from the VA, calling on his personal phone. "Mr. Morrison, I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I wanted you to know that your case has been flagged as high priority. Someone from Congress called, and suddenly everybody knows your name. My supervisor just assigned your case to our most experienced processor." "What does that mean?" "It means instead of 12 to 18 months, you might be looking at 60 to 90 days. And Mr. Morrison, I found another copy of your original file in our archive system. Someone had marked it as resolved by mistake, which is why it disappeared. I'm making sure that doesn't happen again." Tuesday brought a call from Dr. Patricia Wilson, a psychiatrist at the VA who specialized in PTSD cases. Jennifer had arranged for Hank to be evaluated for additional mental health benefits related to his combat service, something he'd never thought to pursue. Many Vietnam veterans don't realize that they qualify for mental health benefits even decades after service, Dr. Wilson explained during their phone conversation. Combat trauma doesn't have an expiration date, Mr. Morrison. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting people, these are all service-connected disabilities that the VA should be treating. The evaluation was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Dr. Wilson explained that it could significantly increase his overall disability rating, which would mean more monthly compensation and better medical coverage. Wednesday morning's meeting with Congressman Wenstrup's staff took place in the federal building downtown. Lisa Chen, the Veterans Affairs liaison, was a sharp young woman who took extensive notes and asked pointed questions about every aspect of Hank's case. "This is exactly the kind of systemic failure we've been documenting," she said, reviewing Jennifer's timeline of delays and lost paperwork. "The congressman is introducing legislation to overhaul the VA's file management system, and your case will be an excellent example of why these reforms are necessary." She assured Hank that her office would personally monitor his claims progress and intervene if there were any further delays. More importantly, she connected him with emergency financial assistance programs that could help with his mounting medical bills. "There's a fund specifically for veterans experiencing financial hardship while waiting for disability claims," Lisa explained. "It's not widely advertised, but it can provide up to $5,000 in emergency assistance. I'm submitting your application today." By Thursday evening, Hank felt like he was living in a different world. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from various VA departments, advocacy organizations, and support services. Jennifer had armed him with information about programs he'd never heard of, rights he didn't know he had, and resources that had been available all along but buried under layers of bureaucracy. The psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Wilson had been thorough but respectful. She'd asked about his combat experiences, his adjustment to civilian life, his sleep patterns, and his relationships with family and friends. Unlike previous interactions with VA personnel, this felt like a genuine effort to understand his situation, rather than find reasons to deny his claims. "Mr. Morrison," she'd said at the end of their 2-hour session, "based on what you've told me today and your service records, I believe you qualify for a 70% PTSD disability rating. Combined with your physical injuries, this should put you at 100% total disability, which means full medical coverage and maximum monthly compensation." That evening, Hank called Sarah for the first time in weeks, without dreading the conversation. "Dad, you sound different," she said. "Better. What's happened?" He told her about meeting Pete Rose, about Jennifer Martinez, about the congressional inquiry and the psychiatric evaluation. For the first time in months, he had good news to share, progress to report. "I can't believe Pete Rose just sat down next to you on a bench," Sarah laughed. "That's like something out of a movie." "He said something that stuck with me," Hank reflected, "about how we're all on the same team, and when you're having a good inning, you help the guys who are struggling. I spent so long feeling like I was fighting this battle alone that I forgot there were people who wanted to help." "Maybe I was wrong about suggesting you move to Phoenix," Sarah said. "It sounds like Cincinnati might be exactly where you need to be." Friday morning brought the call Hank had been waiting for. It was Jennifer, and her voice was filled with excitement. "Hank, sit down. I just got off the phone with the VA regional office. Your claim has been approved. Full disability, retroactive to your original filing date 18 months ago. You'll receive a lump sum payment of approximately $43,000 within 2 weeks, plus monthly payments of $3,200 going forward." The numbers didn't quite register at first. After 18 months of poverty, of choosing between medication and food, of watching bills pile up while bureaucrats shuffled papers, The idea of financial security seemed impossible to grasp. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This isn't some mistake that they'll take back next week. I'm looking at the official approval letter right now. It's real, Hank. You won." That afternoon, Hank found himself back at the riverfront, sitting on the same bench where he'd met Pete Rose just days earlier. The autumn sun was warm on his face, and the Ohio River continued its steady journey toward the Mississippi, carrying barges and dreams toward destinations unknown. His phone buzzed with a text from Charlie Winters. "Heard the good news from Jennifer. You give the rest of us hope, brother." Then another from Dorothy Williams. "Congratulations! Jennifer's helping me resubmit my claim too. Maybe there's hope for all of us." And finally, one from Tommy Chen. "Way to fight the good fight, Hank. Drinks are on you when that back pay comes in." As he sat there watching the city come alive around him, Hank thought about Miguel in his residential treatment program, slowly healing from wounds that had festered for too long. He thought about all the other veterans still fighting their battles with the bureaucracy, still waiting for help that should have come decades ago. But mostly, he thought about Pete Rose, who had taken time out of his Saturday morning to sit with a stranger and offer hope when it was needed most. Sometimes, Hank realized, the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. The river kept flowing, as it always had and always would, carrying the city's dreams and disappointments toward the sea. But for the first time in months, Harold Morrison felt like he was flowing with it, rather than drowning in it. 3 weeks later, Hank stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his apartment, adjusting the tie he hadn't worn in 2 years. The face looking back at him still showed the lines carved by months of stress and uncertainty, but there was something different in his eyes, a light that had been absent for too long. The lump sum payment from the VA had arrived exactly when Jennifer promised it would, and the monthly disability payments had already started. For the first time since his construction days ended, Hank had financial security. He'd paid off his medical bills, caught up on his rent, and even bought a new pair of shoes that didn't have holes in the soles. But more than the money, what had changed was his sense of purpose. Jennifer had asked him to speak at a veterans advocacy meeting downtown to share his story with other veterans who were struggling with the system. The idea terrified him. He'd never been comfortable speaking to groups, but he owed it to the guys still fighting their battles. The meeting was held at the American Legion Post on Vine Street, in a hall that had seen countless gatherings of veterans over the decades. The walls were lined with photos of members who had served in every conflict from World War II to Afghanistan, their faces a testament to sacrifice and service across generations. About 40 people had gathered for the meeting, veterans of all ages, family members, and advocates like Jennifer. Hank recognized several faces from his days waiting at the VA. Charlie Winters was there, along with Dorothy Williams and Tommy Chen. Miguel Santos was present too, looking healthier than Hank had seen him in months, his treatment program having given him tools to manage his PTSD. Jennifer introduced him with a brief overview of his case, emphasizing how congressional intervention and persistent advocacy had cut his waiting time from years to weeks. When she called his name, Hank walked to the front of the room on unsteady legs, his prepared remarks forgotten in a moment of stage fright. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The microphone squeaked with feedback, and he stepped back nervously. "I spent most of my life working with my hands, not my mouth." A few people chuckled, and the sound relaxed him slightly. 6 months ago, I was sitting in this same room, listening to other veterans tell their stories, feeling like I was drowning in paperwork and bureaucracy. I thought I was alone, that somehow I was the only one who couldn't figure out how to get the help I'd earned. He looked around the room, making eye contact with familiar faces. I was angry all the time. Angry at the VA, angry at the system, angry at a country that seemed to have forgotten about guys like us. I was angry at myself for not being strong enough to handle what felt like simple paperwork. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But I learned something important over these past few weeks. I learned that the system isn't broken by accident. It's designed to be difficult, to wear us down, to make us give up. The bureaucracy, the lost files, the endless delays, they're not bugs in the system, they're features. They save the government money by discouraging veterans from pursuing their claims. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. I also learned that we don't have to fight this battle alone. There are people like Jennifer who dedicate their lives to helping us navigate the system. There are congressmen and senators who will intervene when we're being ignored. There are other veterans who will share information and support each other through the process. He paused, thinking about Pete Rose sitting on that bench by the river. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. A few weeks ago, I was sitting by the Ohio River, feeling sorry for myself, when a stranger sat down next to me. Turned out to be Pete Rose. Yeah, the Pete Rose. He didn't know me from Adam, but he took the time to listen to my story and connect me with Jennifer. Said something about how we're all on the same team, and when you're having a good inning, you help the guys who are struggling. Hank looked directly at Miguel, then at Dorothy, then at Tommy. That's why I'm here tonight. My claim got approved, and now I'm having a good inning. So I want to help the guys who are still in the batter's box, still facing down a system that seems determined to strike them out. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been thinking about what Pete Rose said, about baseball being a team sport. Well, I think life is a team sport too, so I've made a decision. He unfolded the paper and held it up. This is a check for $5,000, made out to Jennifer's advocacy organization. It's my way of saying thank you, and my way of making sure other veterans get the help they need. The room erupted in applause, and Hank felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment and pride. He'd never been comfortable being the center of attention, but this felt different. This felt important. After his speech, veterans lined up to talk with him, to share their own stories and ask for advice. Charlie Winters pumped his hand enthusiastically. You did good, brother, really good. Jennifer already helped me file a congressional inquiry on my claim, and I'm hoping for better news soon. Dorothy Williams gave him a hug that reminded him of his daughter. You gave me hope tonight, Hank. I was about to give up on my PTSD claim, but hearing your story, I think I'll keep fighting. Miguel was the last to approach him, and when he did, his eyes were filled with tears. Man, when I had my breakdown at the VA, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never get the help I needed, but seeing you up there talking about not giving up, it means everything. As the meeting wound down, Jennifer approached with a young woman Hank didn't recognize. Hank, I'd like you to meet Amanda Rodriguez. She's a reporter with the Cincinnati Enquirer, and she's been covering veterans issues for the past year. She'd like to interview you about your experience. The idea of talking to a reporter made Hank nervous, but Jennifer assured him that Amanda was trustworthy and genuinely interested in highlighting the problems veterans faced with the VA system. I think your story could help a lot of people, Amanda said. Not just veterans, but their families, and maybe even some of the people who work at the VA who want to do better but don't know how to change the system from within. They scheduled the interview for the following week, and Amanda explained that the story would be part of a larger series about VA reform efforts in Ohio. Over the next few days, Hank's phone rang constantly with calls from veterans who had heard about his speech. Some were asking for advice, others just wanted to share their own stories with someone who would understand. Each conversation reinforced his growing conviction that his experience wasn't unique. There were thousands of veterans across the country facing the same bureaucratic nightmares. The interview with Amanda Rodriguez took place at a coffee shop in Over the Rhine, not far from where Hank had spent so many mornings waiting for the VA to open. She was a thoughtful interviewer, asking probing questions about the emotional toll of fighting the system, the impact on his family relationships, and his thoughts on what needed to change. What would you say to other veterans who are in the same situation you were in 6 months ago? She asked. I'd tell them not to give up, Hank replied without hesitation. I'd tell them that the system is designed to break their spirit, but that doesn't mean they have to let it. There are people who will help, resources available that they might not know about. Most importantly, I'd tell them they're not alone. And what would you say to the people who work at the VA, the ones who might be genuinely trying to help but are constrained by the system? Hank thought for a moment about Brian, the young clerk who had called him on his personal phone to share good news. I'd say that there are ways to help even within a broken system. A kind word, a phone call, treating veterans like human beings instead of case numbers. These things matter more than they might realize. And I'd encourage them to speak up when they see problems, to push for changes from the inside. The article appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition 2 weeks later, accompanied by a photo of Hank sitting on the riverfront bench where he'd met Pete Rose. The headline read, "From Despair to Hope. One veteran's fight against VA bureaucracy." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hank's phone rang constantly with calls from veterans across Ohio and neighboring states. Local television stations wanted interviews. Other newspapers picked up the story. Most importantly, Jennifer's office was flooded with calls from veterans asking for help with their own claims. "You've started something," Jennifer told him during one of their regular coffee meetings. "I've had to hire 2 additional staff members just to handle all the new cases coming in because of your story." But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Pete Rose called him personally. "Hank, I saw the article in the Inquirer. I'm proud of you, man. You took that chance meeting we had and turned it into something that's helping a lot of people." "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Hank replied. "If you hadn't taken the time to listen to a stranger's problems, none of this would have happened." "That's where you're wrong," Pete said. "You don't owe me anything. This is how it's supposed to work. We help each other out. Pay it forward, keep the chain going. You've done that and more." 6 months after his claim was approved, Hank established the Harold Morrison Veterans Advocacy Fund with Jennifer's organization. The fund provided grants to help veterans hire attorneys, pay for medical evaluations, and cover living expenses while their claims were being processed. The initial funding came from his VA back pay, but donations began pouring in from across the community after his story spread. More importantly, he had become a regular volunteer at Jennifer's office, using his experience to help other veterans navigate the system. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he could be found at the downtown library, sitting across from veterans who reminded him of himself 6 months earlier. Frustrated, defeated, feeling invisible and forgotten. "The thing you have to remember," he would tell them, "is that this isn't about charity or pity. This is about getting what you've already earned. You served your country. You held up your end of the deal. Now it's time to make sure your country holds up its end." The work was emotionally draining but deeply satisfying. Every approved claim felt like a victory, not just for the individual veteran, but for the principle that service and sacrifice should be honored, not ignored. On a warm spring evening, almost a year after his chance encounter with Pete Rose, Hank found himself back at the riverfront bench. The Ohio River continued its eternal journey toward the Mississippi, carrying barges and dreams toward destinations unknown. But now, instead of feeling like he was drowning in its current, Hank felt like he was part of its flow, connected to something larger than himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, I saw the article about the advocacy fund in the Arizona Republic. They picked up the story from Cincinnati. I'm so proud of you." Another text came from Miguel. 6 months clean and sober, claim approved last week. Thank you for showing me it was possible." And another from Dorothy. PTSD claim approved. Starting counseling next week. You saved my life. As the sun set over the Cincinnati skyline, painting the river gold and crimson, Harold Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a forgotten man, invisible to a society that had moved on without him. Now he was part of a community, a movement, a chain of people helping people that stretched from coast to coast. The system was still broken. Veterans were still fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight, still waiting for help that was too slow in coming. But change was happening. One claim at a time, one story at a time, one person willing to sit on a bench and listen to a stranger's troubles. Pete Rose had been right about baseball being a team sport, but he'd been even more right about life being the same way. Sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones that made the headlines or filled the record books. Sometimes they were as simple as one person helping another, one good inning helping someone through a difficult at-bat. As the city lights began to twinkle across the water, Hank Morrison, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star winner, veterans advocate, and living proof that hope could survive even the darkest times, stood up from the bench and headed home. Tomorrow, there would be more veterans to help, more battles to fight, more stories to tell. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The river kept flowing, and so would he.